Margaret Sullivan stood at the front of the small wooden church, her white dress feeling heavier with each passing minute. The morning sun streamed through the dusty windows of Cedar Ridge's only church, but it couldn't warm the chill growing in her heart. She had been waiting for over an hour now, and Thomas still hadn't shown up. The townspeople filled the wooden pews behind her, their whispers getting louder as time went by. She could hear them talking about her, wondering where her groom had gone. Some of the women covered their mouths with their hands as they spoke, but their eyes stayed fixed on her back. The men shifted uncomfortably in their seats, checking their pocket watches and shaking their heads. Preacher Williams stood beside her, his Bible open in his weathered hands. He kept looking toward the church door, hoping Thomas would walk through at any moment. But as the minutes ticked by, even he began to look worried. He cleared his throat several times, not knowing what to say to the bride or the waiting crowd. Margaret's father, John Sullivan, paced near the front of the church like a caged animal. His face grew redder with each passing minute. He had spent months planning this wedding, and more importantly, he had already given Thomas a substantial amount of money as part of Margaret's dowry. Now it seemed like both his daughter's future and his money might be gone. The church door creaked open and everyone turned to look. But instead of Thomas, it was young Billy Henderson from the general store. He walked quickly up to Mr. Sullivan and whispered something in his ear. Margaret watched her father's face change from red to white in an instant. His hands clenched into fists, and she knew whatever Billy had told him was very bad news. "He's gone," her father announced to the church, his voice shaking with anger. "Thomas Garrett has left town with another woman and taken our money with him." The church erupted in gasps and murmurs. Some women shook their heads in sympathy, while others seemed almost excited to have such dramatic news to share. Margaret felt her knees go weak, and she had to grab onto the wooden altar rail to keep from falling. Preacher Williams quickly dismissed the congregation, asking everyone to give the Sullivan family privacy in their difficult time. But as people filed out of the church, Margaret could hear their conversations continuing on the front steps. Some felt sorry for her, but others whispered that there must have been something wrong with her for a man to run away on his wedding day. Margaret's younger sister, Ruth, came to stand beside her. She put her arm around Margaret's shoulders, not saying anything but offering what comfort she could. Their mother had died 3 years earlier, and Ruth was the only family member who seemed to truly care about Margaret's feelings, rather than just the family's reputation. "What am I going to do now?" Margaret whispered to Ruth, her voice barely audible. "We'll figure something out," Ruth replied, though she sounded unsure herself. Mr. Sullivan stormed back and forth in front of the altar, his boots echoing loudly in the now mostly empty church. "That scoundrel has ruined us," he said. "Not only has he stolen our money, but now Margaret's reputation is destroyed. Who will want to marry her after this?" Margaret realized that her father was more worried about the money and the family name than he was about her broken heart. She had loved Thomas, or at least she thought she had. They had known each other since childhood, and everyone in town had expected them to marry eventually. But now she wondered if she had ever really known him at all. "The cabin," she said quietly. "What?" her father asked, still pacing. "Thomas built a cabin for us to live in after the wedding. It's out past Miller's Creek near the edge of the territory. Maybe I could stay there for a while until we figure out what to do next." Her father stopped pacing and looked at her as if she had lost her mind. "You can't live out there alone, Margaret. It's too dangerous. There are wild animals, and worse yet, there might be Indians in those parts." But Margaret was already thinking it through. The cabin was small but sturdy. Thomas had spent months building it, cutting the logs himself and chinning the gaps with mud and moss. It had a good stone fireplace, a well for water, and a small garden plot that was ready for planting. If she was careful with supplies and learned to hunt and fish, she might be able to survive on her own. "I can't stay in town," she said, her voice growing stronger. "Everyone will be talking about me, staring at me, pitying me. At least out there, I'll have some peace and quiet to think about my future." Ruth squeezed her hand. "Are you sure about this, Margaret? It sounds awfully lonely and frightening." Margaret looked around the empty church where she should have been celebrating the happiest day of her life. Instead, she was planning how to disappear from the town that no longer felt like home. "I think lonely might be better than humiliated," she said. That afternoon, with Ruth's help, Margaret packed her belongings into a wagon. She took her clothes, some cooking supplies, a rifle that had belonged to her grandfather, and what little food her father was willing to spare. He also gave her $20 from his savings, which wasn't much but would help her buy supplies when she needed them. As she drove the wagon out of town, Margaret passed the house where Thomas had been renting a room. The landlord was outside, loading Thomas's abandoned belongings into a cart. He looked up and tipped his hat to her, but she could see the pity in his eyes. The ride to the cabin took about 2 hours. As she got farther from town, the road became rougher, and the trees grew thicker on both sides. She saw deer watching her from the forest, and once she thought she spotted a wolf, though it disappeared so quickly she couldn't be sure. When she finally reached the cabin, Margaret sat in the wagon for several minutes just looking at it. It was exactly as Thomas had described it to her, small but well-built, with a covered porch and shutters on the windows. There was even a small barn where she could keep her horse and store supplies, but seeing it now, she realized how isolated it really was. The nearest neighbor was at least 5 miles away, and the town was even farther. If anything happened to her out here, it might be days or even weeks before anyone found her. As the sun began to set, Margaret unloaded her belongings and carried them inside. The cabin smelled of fresh wood and had a cold, empty feeling. Thomas had furnished it with a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and some basic kitchen items. Everything a young married couple would need to start their new life together. But instead of starting a new life with her husband, Margaret found herself completely alone in the wilderness, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. As darkness fell around the cabin, she lit a candle and sat at the table, trying not to think about how different this day was supposed to have been. 3 weeks had passed since Margaret moved to the cabin, and she was learning just how hard it was to live alone in the wilderness. Every morning brought new challenges that she had never faced before. The well water was good, but carrying heavy buckets from the well to the cabin left her arms aching. The vegetable garden that Thomas had started was growing weeds faster than vegetables, and she spent hours each day trying to figure out which plants to keep and which ones to pull. Her food supplies were running low much faster than she had expected. She had tried to hunt with her grandfather's rifle, but the loud noise scared away more animals than it killed. She managed to catch a few fish from the creek, but they were small and didn't provide much meat. Most days she ate beans and cornbread, trying to make her supplies last as long as possible. The loneliness was the hardest part. She had grown up in a house full of people, with neighbors close by and the sounds of town life always in the background. Here the silence was so complete that sometimes she talked to herself just to hear a human voice. At night, the darkness seemed to press against the cabin windows, and every sound made her wonder if something dangerous was lurking outside. She had started keeping a journal, writing down her thoughts and the things she did each day. It helped pass the time and made her feel less alone. But lately her entries had become shorter and more worried. She was beginning to wonder if her father had been right about the dangers of living so far from town. The storm started on a Thursday evening in late September. Margaret had spent the day working in the garden, trying to save what vegetables she could before the first frost. The sky had been gray all day and the air felt heavy and still. As the sun went down, she could hear thunder rumbling in the distance. By the time she went to bed, rain was hitting the cabin roof like handfuls of thrown pebbles. The wind picked up, making the trees around the cabin creak and sway. Margaret lay in her bed listening to the storm, grateful that Thomas had built the cabin so solidly. The walls didn't shake and the roof didn't leak even when the rain came down in sheets. But sometime in the middle of the night, she heard something that made her sit up in bed. Between the crashes of thunder and the howling of the wind, she could swear she heard voices. At first, she thought it might be her imagination playing tricks on her. Living alone had made her jumpy, and she sometimes thought she heard things that weren't really there. But then she heard it again, a sound that was definitely human. It sounded like crying, but not the kind of crying an adult would make. It was higher pitched, more desperate, like the sound a child might make when they were scared and hurt. Margaret got out of bed and put on her robe. She picked up the rifle and moved carefully to the front window. The shutters were closed against the storm, but she opened one just a crack and peered out into the darkness. Lightning flashed, lighting up the yard for a brief moment, but she couldn't see anything unusual. The crying sound came again, and this time she was sure it was coming from somewhere near the cabin. It sounded like it might be coming from underneath the front porch. Margaret's heart started beating faster. Her father's warnings about Indians and wild animals came rushing back to her mind. But then she heard the sound again, and she realized it wasn't just one voice. It sounded like two voices, both young and frightened. Whatever was out there was small and in trouble. Margaret stood at the window for several minutes trying to decide what to do. Every sensible part of her mind told her to stay inside until morning. But the crying sounds continued, getting weaker and more desperate. Finally, her conscience won out over her fear. She put on her boots and coat over her nightgown, picked up a lantern and slowly opened the front door. The rain immediately soaked her face and hands, and the wind nearly blew the lantern out. She held it up high and called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" The crying stopped suddenly, as if whoever was making the noise was now afraid they had been discovered. Margaret stepped out onto the porch, holding the lantern in one hand and the rifle in the other, though she wasn't sure she would be able to use it if she needed to. "I heard you crying," she called out over the noise of the storm. "Are you hurt? Do you need help?" Lightning flashed again, and in that brief moment of brightness, Margaret saw them. Two small figures huddled together underneath the far end of her porch, pressed back against the stone foundation of the cabin. They looked like children, but in the darkness and rain she couldn't make out much detail. She moved slowly toward them, holding the lantern low so she wouldn't blind them with the light. As she got closer, she could see that they were indeed children. Young ones, maybe 6 or 7 years old. They were soaking wet and shivering, and their clothes looked like they were made of animal skins rather than regular fabric. When she got close enough to see their faces clearly, Margaret felt her heart skip a beat. These were Indian children. Comanche, she thought, based on their clothing and the way their hair was styled. Their skin was darker than hers, and their black hair hung in wet strands around their faces. For a moment, Margaret stood frozen with surprise and fear. Everything she had ever been told about Indians came flooding back to her. They were dangerous, people said. They attacked settlements and took prisoners. They couldn't be trusted. But looking at these two small children, wet and shivering and obviously scared, Margaret couldn't see any danger. All she could see was two little ones who needed help. The children stared back at her with wide, frightened eyes. One of them, a little girl, was holding on to a boy who looked like he might be her twin brother. The boy had something wrong with his left arm. Even in the dim light, Margaret could see that it was swollen, and he was holding it carefully against his body. "It's okay," Margaret said softly, setting the rifle down and holding out her free hand. "I won't hurt you. Are you hungry? Are you cold?" The children didn't answer, but she could see them shivering even more violently now that the adrenaline of being discovered was wearing off. The little girl felt the boy's forehead with her hand, and even from several feet away, Margaret could tell he was running a fever. Margaret made a decision that would change her life forever. She set the lantern down and slowly approached the children, keeping her movements gentle and non-threatening. When she got close enough, she knelt down so she would be at their eye level. "Come inside," she said, gesturing toward the cabin door. "It's warm and dry in there. I have food and medicine." The children looked at each other, clearly trying to decide whether they could trust this strange white woman. They spoke to each other in words Margaret couldn't understand, their voices so quiet she could barely hear them over the storm. Finally, the little girl helped her brother stand up. He winced with pain as he moved, and Margaret could see that he was weaker than his sister. Without thinking about it, Margaret reached out to help support him, and after a moment's hesitation, the children led her. Together, the three of them made their way through the rain to the cabin door. Margaret helped them inside, then quickly closed the door against the storm. In the warm, bright interior of the cabin, she could see the children clearly for the first time. They were indeed twins, a boy and a girl, and they looked like they had been traveling for quite some time. Their clothes were torn and dirty, and they both looked much too thin. The boy's left arm was definitely injured. It was swollen from his wrist to his elbow, and Margaret could see what looked like an infected wound just below his shoulder. The little girl stayed close to her brother, watching Margaret carefully but not seeming afraid anymore. She was obviously the stronger of the two, and Margaret could tell she had been taking care of her brother during whatever journey had brought them to the cabin. Margaret quickly got towels and helped them dry off, then wrapped them in warm blankets. She built up the fire in the fireplace and put water on to boil for tea. The children sat huddled together near the fire, and gradually they stopped shivering. As Margaret prepared food for them, She couldn't help but wonder how they had come to be alone in the wilderness during such a terrible storm. Where were their parents? How long had they been traveling? And what was she going to do with them now that she had brought them inside? But those were questions for later. Right now, all that mattered was getting them warm, fed, and helping the injured boy. Whatever had brought these children to her door, Margaret knew she couldn't turn them away. The morning after the storm brought bright sunshine and the sound of birds singing. But inside the cabin, Margaret faced a challenge unlike anything she had ever experienced. The two Comanche children sat at her table, eating the breakfast she had prepared, but they hadn't spoken a word to her in English. They communicated with each other in their own language, using quick, quiet words and hand signals that Margaret couldn't understand. The little girl seemed to be the leader of the two. She tested every bite of food carefully before letting her brother eat, and she watched Margaret's every move with intelligent, wary eyes. The boy was clearly very sick. His fever had gotten worse during the night, and the infected wound on his arm was red and swollen. Margaret knew that without proper treatment, the infection could spread and become life-threatening. Margaret had some medical knowledge, thanks to her grandmother who had been known throughout their county as a skilled healer. Before she died, Grandmother Peterson had taught Margaret about using herbs and natural remedies to treat common injuries and illnesses. But treating sick children who couldn't tell her what hurt or how they felt was going to be much more difficult. She started by gathering supplies: clean cloth for bandages, a sharp knife for cleaning the wound, whiskey for disinfecting, and various herbs from her garden that she knew had healing properties. The children watched nervously as she prepared these items, and when she approached the boy with the knife, his sister quickly moved between them. "No hurt," the little girl said in broken English, her voice fierce despite her small size. These were the first English words Margaret had heard either of them speak. Margaret held up her hands to show she meant no harm. "I help," she said slowly, pointing to the boy's injured arm. "Make better. No hurt." She demonstrated by pretending to clean and bandage her own arm, showing the girl exactly what she planned to do. The girl watched carefully, then spoke to her brother in their language. He nodded weakly and held out his injured arm. Working as gently as possible, Margaret cleaned the infected wound. The boy bit his lip to keep from crying out, but tears rolled down his cheeks. His sister held his other hand and spoke to him softly in Comanche, clearly trying to comfort him. Margaret's heart went out to both of them. They were so young to be facing such hardship alone. After cleaning the wound, Margaret applied a paste made from healing herbs and wrapped the arm in clean bandages. She gave the boy tea made from willow bark to help reduce his fever and ease his pain. Then she tucked both children into her bed and sat beside them until they fell asleep. Over the next few days, Margaret established a routine of caring for her unexpected guests. Every few hours, she checked the boy's wound and changed his bandages. She prepared special foods that would be easy for sick children to digest: broths, soft bread, and herbal teas. Gradually, the boy's fever began to break, and the infection in his arm started to heal. As the children began to feel better, they became more curious about Margaret and their surroundings. They explored the cabin carefully, touching objects and asking questions in their own language. Margaret started pointing to things and saying their names in English: table, chair, window, book. The children would repeat the words, then tell her what they called the same objects in Comanche. The language barrier made communication frustrating at first, but Margaret discovered that the children were very smart and eager to learn. The little girl especially picked up new English words quickly. She started by learning the names of foods: bread, water, milk, apple. Soon she was putting together simple sentences like "want water" and "thank you." One evening, as Margaret was preparing supper, the little girl came and stood beside her at the stove. She pointed to herself and said, "Ayana." Then she pointed to her brother, who was sitting by the fire, and said, "Dakota." "Ayana," Margaret repeated, smiling. "That's a beautiful name." "And Dakota." She pointed to herself and said, "Margaret." "Margaret," Ayana said carefully, testing out the unfamiliar sounds. Then she smiled. The first real smile Margaret had seen from either child. As the days passed, Margaret learned more about the twins through their limited shared vocabulary and lots of gesturing. They had been traveling alone for many days before the storm brought them to her cabin. Through Ayana's broken English and drawings in the dirt, Margaret understood that their parents had been killed in some kind of attack. The children had managed to escape, but they had been wandering ever since, hungry and scared, until they found shelter under her porch. Margaret's heart broke for these children who had lost everything. She knew what it felt like to have your whole life turned upside down in a single day. The difference was that she had chosen to leave her old life behind, while Ayana and Dakota had had their family torn away from them. As Dakota grew stronger, he began to help Margaret with small tasks around the cabin. He showed her how to track animals by reading their footprints in the mud, and how to identify which plants in the forest were good to eat. Ayana taught her how to weave grass into baskets and how to tan animal hides to make them soft and waterproof. In return, Margaret taught them more English words and showed them how to use the tools and equipment in the cabin. She taught them to read simple words and write letters in the dirt with sticks. Both children were eager learners, and Margaret was amazed at how quickly they adapted to their new surroundings. But even as they grew more comfortable with each other, Margaret knew this situation couldn't last forever. The children needed proper homes with families who could care for them long term, and she needed to figure out what the law required her to do about finding 2 Indian children living on her property. The problem was that Margaret had grown attached to Ayana and Dakota in a way that surprised her. Taking care of them had given her a purpose she hadn't felt since her wedding day disaster. They needed her, and she was discovering that she needed them too. For the first time since Thomas had abandoned her, she felt like her life had meaning. But she also knew that most white people would not understand or approve of her caring for Indian children. The frontier was full of stories about conflicts between settlers and native tribes. Many people believed that all Indians were dangerous enemies who could not be trusted. Margaret had heard these stories all her life, but living with Ayana and Dakota was showing her a different reality. These were just children, smart, loving, resilient children who had suffered a terrible loss and were trying to survive in a hostile world. They laughed and played and got into mischief just like any other children. They had feelings and fears and dreams just like she did. One evening, as the 3 of them sat by the fire after supper, Dakota pointed to a picture in one of Margaret's books, a drawing of a family sitting around a dinner table. He looked at Margaret, then at Ayana, then back at the picture. "Family?" he asked in English. Margaret's throat tightened with emotion. She looked at these 2 children who had come to mean so much to her, and she realized that somewhere along the way they had become a family. Not a traditional family, certainly, but a real one nonetheless. "Yes," she said softly. "Family." Ayana moved closer to Margaret on the bench and leaned against her shoulder. Dakota came and sat on her other side. For a few minutes they just sat together in comfortable silence, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. Margaret knew that difficult times were ahead. Sooner or later someone would discover the children living with her, and she would have to make some hard choices. But for now, in this moment, she felt more complete and happy than she had since before her wedding day disaster. She had found her purpose in caring for these children, and they had found safety and love with her. Whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them together as a family. Margaret had been living with Ayana and Dakota for almost 6 weeks when Dr. Hayes came riding up to her cabin on a crisp October morning. She was outside teaching the twins how to split firewood when she heard the sound of horse hooves on the path. Her heart immediately started beating faster. She had been dreading this moment since the children first arrived. Dr. Samuel Hayes was the only person from town who had bothered to check on her since she moved to the cabin. He was a kind man in his 50s who had known Margaret's family for years. He had delivered Margaret and her sister when they were born, and he had been at her mother's bedside when she died. If anyone from town was going to understand her situation, it would be Dr. Hayes. But as his horse came into view around the bend in the path, Margaret felt panic rising in her chest. Ayana and Dakota had heard the horse too, and they immediately dropped their wood and started moving toward the forest. Margaret had taught them to hide if strangers came near the cabin, but she had hoped this day would never come. "Stay calm," she whispered to them in English, then repeated it in the few Comanche words she had learned. "Hide in the barn. I will come get you when it's safe." The twins nodded and quickly disappeared behind the cabin. Margaret took a deep breath, smoothed down her dress, and walked out to meet Dr. Hayes with what she hoped looked like a welcoming smile. "Margaret, my dear, Dr. Hayes said as he dismounted his horse. "You look well. I was worried about you living out here all alone." "I'm managing just fine, Dr. Hayes," Margaret replied, hoping her voice sounded normal. "Would you like some coffee? I was just about to put a pot on." "That would be wonderful," he said, tying his horse to the porch railing. "I brought you some medicine supplies and some letters from your sister. She's been asking me to check on you." They went inside the cabin and Margaret busied herself making coffee while Dr. Hayes settled into one of the chairs at her table. She tried to act naturally, but she was acutely aware of all the signs around the cabin that showed she wasn't living alone. There were 3 plates on the table from breakfast, small moccasins by the door, and children's drawings pinned to the wall. Dr. Hayes was an observant man. It was part of what made him a good doctor. Margaret saw his eyes taking in these details, and she watched his expression change from friendly concern to confusion, and then to alarm. "Margaret," he said slowly, "are you caring for children out here?" She considered lying, but Dr. Hayes had known her since she was born. He would see right through any deception. "Yes," she said simply, not offering any more information. "Where are they? Are they well? Are they from town?" The questions came quickly, showing his medical instincts kicking in. Before Margaret could answer, they both heard a sound from outside, Dakota coughing. The boy had mostly recovered from his fever, but he still had a slight cough that lingered from his illness. Dr. Hayes stood up immediately. "I need to see them, Margaret. If there are sick children here, they need medical attention." "They're fine, Dr. Hayes. I've been taking good care of them." But the doctor was already moving toward the door. Margaret hurried after him, her mind racing as she tried to figure out what to say. Maybe she could introduce the children as refugees from another settlement. Maybe she could claim they were distant relatives. They found Ayanna and Dakota crouched behind the barn, clearly trying to stay hidden. When they saw Dr. Hayes, they pressed themselves back against the wooden wall, their eyes wide with fear. Dr. Hayes stopped short when he saw them. Margaret watched his face change as he took in their appearance, their dark skin, their black hair, their clothes that were clearly made in the Comanche style, even though Margaret had also given them some regular shirts and pants. "Dear God, Margaret," he whispered. "These are Indian children. Their names are Ayanna and Dakota," Margaret said, moving to stand protectively in front of the twins. "They're orphans. Their parents were killed and they were starving when I found them. I couldn't just let them die." Dr. Hayes looked from the children to Margaret and back again, his face pale with shock. "Do you understand what you've done? Do you realize how dangerous this is?" "Dangerous to whom?" Margaret asked, her voice getting stronger. "They're children, Dr. Hayes. They're 6 years old. What danger could they possibly pose?" "It's not about what danger they pose," Dr. Hayes said, running his hands through his hair. "It's about what people will think, what they'll do when they find out. Margaret, there are folks in town who would—" He stopped, clearly not wanting to finish that thought in front of the children. Margaret knelt down next to Ayanna and Dakota and spoke to them gently. "It's okay. This is Dr. Hayes. He's a friend. He helps people when they're sick." Dakota stepped forward slowly and rolled up his sleeve to show Dr. Hayes the healing wound on his arm. "Margaret, help," he said in careful English. "Make better." Despite his shock, Dr. Hayes's medical instincts took over. He knelt down and gently examined Dakota's arm, checking the way the wound was healing and looking at the herbal treatment Margaret had applied. "You did good work," he admitted grudgingly to Margaret. This could have been very serious if it hadn't been treated properly. He checked both children's general health, listening to their hearts and looking in their eyes and throats. Margaret could see that his doctor's training was battling with his fear about the situation. "They're healthy now," he said finally. "But Margaret, you can't keep them here. When people in town find out, and they will find out eventually, there's going to be trouble." "Big trouble? What kind of trouble?" Margaret asked, though she was afraid she already knew. Dr. Hayes looked around to make sure the children weren't listening, then lowered his voice. "There's been talk in town about Indian raids on settlements to the south. People are scared and angry. Some of the men have been talking about forming groups to search for hostile Indians in the area. If they find out you're harboring Indian children," he didn't need to finish. Margaret knew that frightened people could do terrible things, especially when they thought their families were in danger. "But Ayanna and Dakota aren't hostile," she protested. "They're just children who need help. I know that, and you know that. But try explaining that to a group of armed men who are convinced that all Indians are enemies. Margaret felt her world starting to crumble around her once again. Just when she had found purpose and happiness in caring for these children, it was being threatened by the same kind of small-minded thinking that had made her life in town so miserable after Thomas left her. "What are you going to do?" she asked Dr. Hayes. "Are you going to tell people in town about them?" Dr. Hayes was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with his conscience. "I should," he said finally. "It would be the right thing to do for your safety and for theirs. The territorial authorities could find proper homes for them with other Indians." "You mean they could put them on a reservation?" Margaret said bitterly. "It would be better than what might happen to them here." Margaret looked at Ayanna and Dakota, who were sitting quietly nearby, probably understanding more of the conversation than the adults realized. These children had already lost their parents, their home, their entire way of life. Now they might lose the only security they had found. "Please, Dr. Hayes," she said, "don't tell anyone about them yet. Give me some time to figure out what to do." "How much time?" "A few weeks. Maybe a month." "Let me think of another solution." Dr. Hayes shook his head. "Margaret, there is no other solution. You can't hide 2 Indian children indefinitely. Someone else is going to find out, and when they do, you're going to be in danger too. From my own neighbors? From people who are scared and angry and looking for someone to blame for their problems, yes." Margaret felt tears starting to form in her eyes. "These children have become my family, Dr. Hayes. They're all I have in the world. I can't just abandon them." Dr. Hayes looked at her with sympathy, but also with determination. "I'll give you 2 weeks," he said. 2 weeks to figure out how to get them someplace safe. After that, I have to do what's best for everyone involved." That evening, after Dr. Hayes had ridden back to town, Margaret sat with Ayanna and Dakota by the fireplace and tried to explain what was happening. The children understood more than she had expected. They had learned enough English to follow the basic idea that they were in danger and might have to leave. "Where we go?" Ayanna asked. Margaret wished she had an answer for that question. She had 2 weeks to find a solution that would keep the children safe while allowing them to stay together as a family, but she had no idea where to start looking for such a miracle. After Dr. Hayes's warning, Margaret knew that their peaceful days at the cabin were numbered. Instead of giving up, she decided to use whatever time they had left to strengthen the bond between herself and the children. If they were going to face an uncertain future together, they needed to understand each other as completely as possible. The first thing Margaret did was throw away all her fancy dresses and petticoats. She had been keeping them in a trunk, thinking that someday she might need them if she decided to return to civilized society. But looking at them now, she realized they represented a life that no longer fit who she was becoming. Instead, she asked Ayanna to teach her how to make clothes like the ones the children wore. Using deer hide that Dakota had taught her to hunt and prepare, they spent several days creating practical frontier clothing. Margaret learned to sew with sinew instead of thread, and to cut patterns that allowed for easy movement and hard work. When she looked at herself in her small mirror, wearing the buckskin dress and moccasins, Margaret barely recognized the woman staring back at her. The pampered town girl who had waited at the altar for Thomas was completely gone. In her place was someone stronger, more practical, and more connected to the natural world around her. The children taught her other survival skills that would have been considered scandalous for a proper lady to know. Dakota showed her how to track deer through the forest, reading signs in broken twigs and disturbed leaves that told the story of which animals had passed by and when. He taught her to move quietly through the woods, stepping carefully to avoid making noise that would scare away game. Ayanna taught her to identify edible plants and roots, and how to prepare them in ways that brought out their best flavors and preserved them for winter storage. She showed Margaret how to weave baskets from grass and thin branches, creating containers that were both beautiful and useful. But the most important thing the children taught her was their language. Every day they spent time teaching Margaret new Comanche words and phrases. She learned to say thank you and please and I love you. She learned the words for family members, animals, weather, and emotions. In return, Margaret continued teaching them English, but she also shared things about her own culture and background. She told them stories from her childhood, taught them songs her mother had sung to her, and explained the customs and traditions of the white settlers. As the weeks passed, Margaret began to understand that the children were teaching her these things for a specific reason. One evening, as they sat around the fire, Ayana spoke to her seriously in a mixture of English and Comanche. "If bad men come," Ayana said, "you must know our ways. Our people need to see that you understand, that you respect who we are." Margaret realized that the children were preparing her for something. They expected that eventually they would encounter other Comanche people, and they wanted to make sure Margaret would be accepted and protected. "Tell me about your people," Margaret said. "Tell me about your family before you came to live with me." Through a combination of words and gestures, the children told her about their life before their parents died. Their father had been a respected warrior and hunter. Their mother had been known for her skill at making beautiful beadwork and for her knowledge of healing plants. They had lived in a village with their extended family, grandparents, aunts and uncles, cousins. "Uncle Nalnish," Dakota said, pointing to the north, "still alive. Strong warrior. He looked for us." Margaret felt a chill when she heard this. "Your uncle is looking for you?" Ayana nodded. "Our people, they never stop looking for lost children. Uncle will find us someday." This was both reassuring and terrifying to Margaret. It meant that the children might eventually be reunited with their surviving family, which was wonderful. But it also meant that Comanche warriors might come looking for them at any time, which could be very dangerous for everyone involved. "What will your uncle think of me?" Margaret asked. "Will he be angry that I've been taking care of you?" The children looked at each other and had a quick conversation in Comanche. Then Ayana turned back to Margaret. "If you are good to us, if you treat us like family, Uncle will see this," she said. "But you must show respect. You must show that you understand our ways." Over the following days, the children taught Margaret about Comanche customs and traditions with new urgency. They showed her how to greet people properly, how to show respect to elders, and how to behave in ways that would demonstrate that she was not an enemy. They taught her about their spiritual beliefs, explaining how they viewed the natural world as full of spirits that needed to be honored and respected. They showed her how to say prayers of gratitude for the animals they hunted and the plants they gathered for food. Margaret found these teachings fascinating and beautiful. They gave her a deeper appreciation for the world around her and helped her understand why the children had such a strong connection to the land and animals. But the most important lesson they taught her was about family loyalty. In Comanche culture, they explained family bonds were sacred. Once someone was accepted as family, they were family forever, with all the rights and responsibilities that came with that relationship. "You are our family now," Dakota told her one day as they worked together to repair the roof of the cabin. "That means we protect each other always." Margaret felt tears come to her eyes when she heard this. She had never experienced such absolute loyalty and acceptance. Even her birth family had been quick to judge her when Thomas abandoned her. But these children, who barely knew her, had embraced her completely as one of their own. As November arrived and the weather grew colder, Margaret made changes to the cabin to accommodate their new lifestyle. She hung animal hides over the windows instead of curtains, arranged the furniture in a circle around the fire as the children preferred, and created sleeping areas with soft furs instead of regular bedding. She also began preparing for the possibility that they might need to leave the cabin quickly. She packed essential supplies in leather bags that could be carried easily, and she made sure they all had warm clothes and sturdy shoes for traveling. The children approved of these preparations. They had learned to live with uncertainty, always ready to move if danger threatened. They taught Margaret how to cache supplies in hidden locations around the property, so they would have resources available if they ever needed to return. But even as they prepared for an uncertain future, Margaret treasured the quiet evenings they spent together in the cabin. They would cook dinner together, with each person contributing something to the meal. Then they would sit by the fire telling stories, singing songs, or just enjoying each other's company. These were some of the happiest moments Margaret had ever experienced. She felt truly part of a family in a way she never had before. The children needed her, but she needed them just as much. They had all found something precious together, a sense of belonging and unconditional love. But Margaret knew that their peaceful time was running out. Dr. Hayes's 2-week deadline had already passed, and she worried that he might decide to tell the town authorities about the children at any time. Beyond that, winter was coming, and she wasn't sure they had enough supplies to get through the cold months. Most importantly, she had begun to notice signs that they were being watched. Sometimes she would see movements in the forest that didn't seem to be caused by animals. Occasionally, she would find small items moved or disturbed in ways that suggested someone had been near the cabin while they were away. The children had noticed these signs too, and they were becoming increasingly alert and cautious. Margaret could tell they were expecting something to happen soon. One evening, as they prepared for bed, Ayana came to Margaret and handed her a small leather pouch decorated with colorful beads. "For you," she said, "medicine bag. We'll protect you when trouble comes." Margaret accepted the gift with deep gratitude, understanding that this was a sacred item in Comanche culture. By giving it to her, Ayana was formally accepting her as family and offering her the protection of their spiritual beliefs. "Thank you," Margaret said in Comanche, one of the phrases she had learned well. "I will treasure this always." As she tucked the children into bed that night, Margaret had a feeling that major changes were coming to their little family. She didn't know what form those changes would take, but she was determined to face them with the courage and wisdom the children had taught her. Whatever happened next, they would face it together as a real family, bound not by blood, but by love, respect, and unshakable loyalty to each other. As December arrived and the first snow began to fall, Margaret noticed that Ayana and Dakota were acting differently. They had always been alert and careful, but now they seemed to be listening for something specific. They would stop in the middle of conversations and cock their heads to one side, as if they heard sounds that Margaret couldn't detect. During their daily walks around the property, the children began paying special attention to certain trees and rocks. Margaret watched them trace symbols in the bark with their fingers, symbols that looked like they meant something important. When she asked about these markings, the children exchanged glances and spoke to each other in rapid Comanche. "Old signs," Dakota finally explained in English. "From before." "Before what?" "Before we come here. Our people leave marks when they travel through territory. Tell others who was here, when, where they go next." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold weather. "Are these fresh signs?" "Recent ones." Ayana shook her head. "Old, many seasons old, but..." She struggled to find the English words she needed. "But we make new ones now." "New ones? What kind of new ones?" The children led her to a tall oak tree at the edge of their property. Using a sharp stone, Dakota had carved a series of lines and curves into the bark. The symbols were small and subtle. Someone would have to look closely to notice them. "We tell our story," he explained. "We say we are here, we are safe, we are with friend who helps us." Margaret stared at the symbols, realizing what this meant. "So if other Comanche people come through this area, they'll know you're here?" "Yes," Ayana said simply. "And they know you are a good person. You take care of children who are not your blood children." Over the following days, Margaret began to understand that the twins were deliberately leaving messages for their people. They carved symbols in trees, arranged rocks in specific patterns, and left small bundles of grass and feathers in locations that seemed random to Margaret, but clearly had significance in Comanche culture. "Are you trying to contact your uncle?" Margaret asked one evening as they sat by the fire. The children looked at each other with expressions that seemed older than their years. Finally, Ayana spoke. "Uncle Nalnish is great tracker, best in our tribe. If we leave signs, he will find them eventually, but..." She paused, searching for words. "Maybe he find us before we ready." "What do you mean, before you're ready?" Dakota answered this time. "Uncle will want to take us back to our people. That is right thing for Comanche children, but Uncle might not understand about you. Might think you are enemy who stole us." Margaret felt her stomach drop. She had been so focused on protecting the children from hostile white settlers that she hadn't fully considered how Comanche warriors might react to finding their children living with a white woman. "Would he hurt me?" "Not if we explain properly," Ayana said, but she didn't sound completely certain. "That is why we teach you our ways, our words. If you show respect, if you prove you care for us like mother, Uncle will see truth." But Margaret could tell that both children were worried about this potential meeting. They spent increasing amounts of time teaching her Comanche phrases and customs, drilling her on proper behavior until she could greet people appropriately and express basic ideas without help. As the days grew shorter and colder, Margaret began to notice other signs that they were being observed. Sometimes she would find footprints in the snow around the cabin, prints that were too large to belong to the children and too small to belong to her. The prints appeared to have been made by someone wearing moccasins rather than boots. More disturbing, were the times when she would return from hunting or gathering firewood to find small items in the cabin moved, slightly from where she had left them. Nothing was taken, but someone had clearly been inside their home while they were away. The children seemed aware of these intrusions, but they didn't appear frightened by them. If anything, they seemed more alert and excited, as if they were expecting something important to happen. "Is it your uncle?" Margaret asked one morning after finding clear evidence that someone had been near their woodpile during the night. "Maybe," Dakota said, "or maybe other warriors from our band. They would scout carefully before approaching. Why don't they just come to the door and announce themselves?" Ayanna tried to explain the complex protocols involved in such a situation. "Must be sure first. Must watch and learn. See if you treat us well. See if we are healthy and safe. See if you have weapons ready to fight. Or if you are a peaceful person." Margaret realized that she and the children were being evaluated by unseen observers who would determine their fate based on what they witnessed. This put her in the strange position of trying to prove her worthiness to people she couldn't see and didn't know how to communicate with directly. She began to modify her behavior based on what the children told her would make a good impression. She made sure to always treat Ayanna and Dakota with obvious affection and respect. She shared her food generously with them and deferred to their knowledge about hunting and survival skills. She participated in their daily prayers and showed reverence for the natural world around them. Most importantly, she made sure never to discipline the children harshly or show anger toward them, even when they made mistakes. The children had explained that how a person treated children was considered the most important measure of their character in Comanche culture, but the constant sense of being watched was wearing on Margaret's nerves. She found herself jumping at unexpected sounds and constantly scanning the tree line around their property. The children seemed much more comfortable with the situation. But then they had grown up in a culture where being observed and evaluated by warriors was probably normal. One snowy evening in mid-December, as Margaret was preparing supper, Dakota suddenly stood up from where he had been sitting by the fire. "Someone comes," he said quietly. Margaret listened but heard nothing except the wind in the trees. "Are you sure?" Both children were now standing alert, their heads turned toward the north. After a few moments, Margaret heard it too, the very faint sound of horses moving through the forest, still quite far away but getting closer. "Is it your uncle?" she asked. "We think so," Ayanna said, "but not sure. Could be white men from town, could be soldiers, could be our people." Margaret felt her heart start to race. After weeks of preparing for this moment, it was finally happening. She was about to meet the Comanche warriors who would decide whether she was friend or enemy, whether she could stay with the children or would be separated from them forever. "What should I do?" she asked. "Act natural," Dakota said. "Show that we are family, that you love us and we love you. Do not show weapons unless they show weapons first. Let us speak first when they arrive." Margaret nodded, trying to calm her racing pulse. She continued preparing supper as if nothing unusual was happening, but her hands were shaking as she stirred the pot of stew. The sound of horses grew closer over the next hour. By the time full darkness had fallen, Margaret could occasionally catch glimpses of movement in the trees around their property. Their visitors, whoever they were, had arrived and were taking positions around the cabin. "How many do you think there are?" Margaret whispered. The children listened carefully to sounds she couldn't detect. "Many," Ayanna said. "More than just uncle, maybe full war party." Margaret's mouth went dry. A war party sounded much more dangerous than a single uncle coming to collect his nephew and niece. As if reading her thoughts, Dakota said, "War party not always mean war. Sometimes just mean group of warriors traveling together. Could be hunting party, could be scouting party. We not know their purpose until we see them." They sat in tense silence for another hour, knowing they were surrounded but not knowing what their watchers intended. Finally, both children stood up simultaneously. "They are ready," Ayanna announced. "Tomorrow at sunrise they will come to our door." Margaret looked at the two small faces that had become so precious to her over the past months. Tomorrow morning she would learn whether the family she had found with these children would be allowed to continue, or whether this would be their last night together. "Whatever happens," she told them, "I want you to know that taking care of you has been the greatest joy of my life. You have taught me what it means to really love someone." The children came and hugged her tightly, one on each side. "You are our mother now," Dakota said. "That will never change, no matter what happens tomorrow." As Margaret tucked the children into bed that night, she could see the shadows of mounted warriors positioned around their cabin. Tomorrow at sunrise, she would face the greatest test of her life, proving to a Comanche war party that she deserved to be part of their family. Margaret barely slept that night. Every small sound outside the cabin made her wonder if the warriors were moving closer, or if other dangers might be approaching. She lay in her bed listening to the steady breathing of Ayanna and Dakota, who seemed much calmer than she felt. Several times she got up to peek through the shutters, and each time she could see the faint silhouettes of mounted figures positioned around their property. Just before dawn, she heard new sounds, horses approaching from the direction of town. Her heart sank as she recognized the distinctive rhythm of cavalry horses moving in formation. Through the window, she could see torches bobbing in the distance, still perhaps a mile away, but definitely heading toward her cabin. Margaret quickly woke the children. "Soldiers are coming," she whispered. "And your people are still here. This could be very bad." Ayanna and Dakota were instantly alert. They dressed quickly and went to the window to assess the situation. After listening carefully to sounds Margaret couldn't interpret, they turned to her with grim expressions. "Many soldiers," Dakota said. 20, maybe more. They will be here soon after sun comes up." "What will your uncle do?" Margaret asked. "Uncle will protect us," Ayanna said with certainty. "But there might be fighting. Soldiers and warriors. They do not trust each other." Margaret realized that she and the children were about to be caught in the middle of a potential battle between two groups that saw each other as enemies. The cavalry was probably coming to investigate reports of Indians in the area, while the Comanche war party was here to reclaim their children. Neither group would be happy to encounter the other. As the first rays of sunlight began to appear on the horizon, Margaret made a decision that surprised even herself. She opened the cabin door and stepped out onto the porch, knowing that Comanche warriors could see her from their positions in the trees. "I need to speak with your war chief," she called, out in the loudest voice she could manage. While still speaking the Comanche words carefully, she hoped she was pronouncing everything correctly. There was silence for several long moments. Then a figure emerged from behind a large oak tree about 50 yards from the cabin. He was tall and powerfully built, wearing traditional Comanche clothing decorated with feathers and beadwork. His face was painted with symbols that Margaret didn't understand, but his bearing left no doubt that this was a man of authority and respect among his people. Behind him, other warriors began to emerge from their hiding places. Margaret counted at least 12 mounted men, all armed with rifles, bows, and lances. They formed a semicircle around the front of the cabin, but they made no aggressive moves. Ayanna and Dakota came out of the cabin and stood beside Margaret on the porch. When the war chief saw them, his stern expression softened slightly. He spoke to them in rapid Comanche, and they responded in the same language. Margaret could tell that this was indeed their uncle. There was obvious affection between them despite the tense circumstances. The conversation between the children and their uncle continued for several minutes. Margaret caught a few words she recognized, including her own name and words that meant mother and family. She could see that Ayanna and Dakota were explaining their situation and trying to vouch for her character. Finally, the war chief looked directly at Margaret. When he spoke, his English was better than she had expected, though he spoke slowly and carefully. "My sister's children say you have cared for them as your own children. They say you have treated them with kindness and respect." "That's true," Margaret replied. "They came to me during a storm, hungry and sick. I couldn't turn them away. They also say you have learned our ways, that you honor our traditions and our connection to the land. They have taught me many things. I have great respect for your people and your culture." The war chief studied her for a long moment, then nodded slightly. "I am Nalnish. These children are the only family I have left from my sister's line. Their safety is more important to me than my own life." "I understand that," Margaret said. "They have become my family too. I would do anything to protect them." Just as Nalnish seemed about to respond, they all heard the sound of approaching cavalry horses getting much closer. The soldiers would be visible within minutes. "Bluecoats come," one of the other warriors called out in English. Nalnish's expression hardened. "They seek to drive us from our traditional hunting grounds. They will not be pleased to find us here." Margaret realized that the situation was about to become extremely dangerous. The cavalry would see a group of armed Comanche warriors near a white settlement and would likely assume they were planning an attack. The warriors would see approaching soldiers as a threat to their mission to retrieve their children. "Maybe I can talk to them," Margaret suggested. "I can explain that you're here peacefully, that you're just family members collecting the children." Nalnish shook his head. "Bluecoats do not listen to explanations. They see warriors, they think only of fighting." The sound of horses was getting louder. Margaret estimated that the cavalry patrol would reach the cabin within the next 10 minutes. She had to make a decision quickly. "Uncle," Ayanna said in English so Margaret could understand, "Margaret is our family now. If she stays with white people, they will take us away from her and put us on reservation. If she comes with us, we can all stay together." Margaret's heart began to race as she understood what Ayanna was suggesting. The little girl was asking her to leave her old life completely behind and join the Comanche people. Nalnish looked at Margaret with new interest. "Would you do this? Would you leave your people to stay with ours?" Margaret thought about what she would be leaving behind. The cabin Thomas had built, her few remaining possessions, the small amount of money she had saved, her connection to the town and the life she had known. But then she looked at Ayanna and Dakota, and she realized that everything truly important to her was standing right there on the porch. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "If it means we can stay together as a family, yes." The war chief studied her face carefully, as if trying to determine whether she truly meant what she was saying. "Life with our people would be very different from what you know. We move often, following the buffalo and the seasons. You would need to learn many new skills, and there would always be danger from soldiers who hunt us." "I understand," Margaret said, "but I've already learned that I'm stronger than I thought I was. And I know that whatever challenges we should face them together." The sound of cavalry horses was now very close. They would arrive within the next few minutes. Nalnish made a quick decision. "If you truly wish to join our people, you must come with us now. Gather only what you can carry quickly. We cannot wait for the soldiers to arrive." Margaret's pulse quickened. This was it, the moment that would determine the rest of her life. She could go back inside the cabin and wait for the cavalry, which would probably mean losing the children forever, or she could trust these warriors and leap into an unknown future. "Ayanna, Dakota, get our medicine bag and the warmest clothes," she said quickly. "I'll get food and water for traveling." The children rushed into the cabin while Margaret grabbed her rifle, ammunition, and a leather satchel containing dried meat, hardtack, and other supplies they had prepared for emergencies. She also took the letters from her sister and a small daguerreotype of her mother, the only keepsakes she wanted to save from her old life. As she came back outside, she could see dust clouds on the horizon, indicating that the cavalry was only minutes away. Nalnish had brought an extra horse, a strong-looking mare with a blanket saddle in the Comanche style. "You can ride?" he asked. "Yes," Margaret said, grateful for the riding lessons her father had insisted on when she was younger. Ayanna and Dakota came running out of the cabin with their few belongings. They looked excited rather than frightened. This was a homecoming for them, even though they were also sad to leave the place where they had been so happy. Margaret took one last look at the cabin that had been her refuge and the place where she had found her true purpose in life. Then she mounted the horse Nalnish had provided and fell in line with the other riders. As they rode north toward the forest, Margaret could hear the cavalry patrol arriving at her now empty cabin. She wondered what the soldiers would think when they found evidence that she had been living there with the children, and what kind of search they might launch when they discovered that all three of them had vanished. But those were concerns for the future. Right now, Margaret focused on riding well and keeping up with the experienced warriors who were escorting her toward a completely new way of life. She had made her choice, to follow love rather than fear, to choose family over safety, to trust in the unknown rather than accepting the limitations of the known. As they crested a hill and the cabin disappeared from view behind them, Margaret felt both terror and exhilaration. She was riding away from everything familiar toward a future she couldn't imagine, but she was doing it with the two people she loved most in the world, and that made all the uncertainty worthwhile. The sun was fully risen by the time Margaret and her new family reached the Comanche encampment. They had ridden for nearly 3 hours through forest and grassland that Margaret had never seen before, following trails that seemed invisible to her, but were clearly well known to her companions. The camp was larger than she had expected. At least 40 teepees arranged in a rough circle, with horses grazing nearby and people going about their morning activities. As their group approached the camp, Margaret could see people stopping their work to watch them arrive. Children ran alongside their horses, chattering excitedly in Comanche. Adults gathered in small groups, clearly curious about the white woman riding with their warriors. Margaret felt her nervousness return as she realized that dozens of people were staring at her. She had proven herself to Nalnish and his war party, but now she would need to win acceptance from an entire community. These people had every reason to distrust white settlers, and she would need to demonstrate that she was different from the soldiers and politicians who had brought so much suffering to their people. Nalnish led them to the center of the camp, where an elderly man with elaborately decorated clothing was waiting. Margaret could tell immediately that this was someone of great importance, probably the chief of this particular band. "That is Grandfather Stone Bear," Ayana whispered to Margaret in English. "He is our great uncle, our father's brother. Very wise man, very respected." Stone Bear studied Margaret with sharp, intelligent eyes as Nalnish dismounted and approached him. The two men spoke in rapid Comanche for several minutes, with Nalnish obviously explaining the situation and seeking permission for Margaret to join the community. Margaret remained mounted, as she had been instructed, waiting to be invited to dismount and formally introduced. Around them, more and more people gathered to witness this unusual event. She could see women holding babies, elderly people supported by walking sticks, and children peeking out from behind their parents' legs. Finally, Stone Bear nodded to Nalnish and then looked directly at Margaret. When he spoke, his English was slow but clear, showing that he had learned the language through many years of dealing with traders and government officials. "My nephew tells me that you have cared for our children as if they were your own blood. He says you have learned our ways and shown respect for our traditions. Is this true?" "Yes, sir," Margaret replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Ayana and Dakota came to me during a terrible storm. They were sick and hungry, and I couldn't turn them away. Taking care of them has been the greatest honor of my life. And now you wish to join our people to live among us and follow our way of life?" Margaret looked around the camp, taking in the faces watching her. Some looked curious, others skeptical, and a few seemed openly hostile. She understood their wariness. She represented a people who had brought disease, war, and broken promises to their communities. "I know I have much to learn," she said. "I know that many of your people have suffered because of actions by my people. But I love Ayana and Dakota as my own children, and I believe that understanding between our peoples is possible. If you'll have me, I would be honored to live among you and contribute whatever skills I can to your community." Stone Bear was quiet for a long moment, studying her face carefully. Then he turned to Ayana and Dakota, who had dismounted and were standing nearby. He spoke to them in Comanche, asking questions that the children answered readily. Margaret watched as the twins told their story, presumably describing how she had found them, how she had nursed Dakota back to health, and how she had treated them during their months together. Other people in the crowd began nodding as they listened, and Margaret sensed that the children's testimony was carrying significant weight. Elderly woman stepped forward from the crowd and spoke to Stone Bear. Margaret could see that this woman commanded great respect. People moved aside to let her pass, and even the chief listened to her words with obvious deference. "This is Grandmother Bright Moon," Ayana whispered. "She is medicine woman, very important person in our band. She lost her own daughter to white man's diseases. If she accepts you, others will too." Bright Moon approached Margaret's horse and looked up at her with eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. She spoke a few words in Comanche, and Margaret recognized them as a request for her to dismount. Margaret climbed down from her horse and stood before the medicine woman, who was at least 6 inches shorter than she was, but somehow seemed to tower over her. Bright Moon walked around Margaret slowly, examining her clothes, her posture, her hands, even her hair. Then the old woman did something unexpected. She reached out and touched the leather medicine bag that Ayana had given Margaret weeks earlier. She spoke rapidly to the children, who responded with obvious excitement. "Grandmother Bright Moon says this is her work," Dakota translated. "She made this medicine bag for our mother when we were born. She is happy to see that Ayana gave it to you. It means you are truly family to us." The medicine woman nodded approvingly and spoke to Stone Bear. Whatever she said seemed to settle the matter, because the chief's stern expression relaxed into something approaching a smile. Bright Moon says the spirits have guided you to us for a purpose, Stone Bear announced to the crowd. She says you have a good heart, and that you will bring skills our people need. You may stay with us and learn our ways. A cheer went up from parts of the crowd, though Margaret noticed that not everyone seemed pleased with this decision. Change was always difficult, and she understood that some people would need more time to accept her presence. Over the following hours, Margaret was introduced to various members of the community and shown where she would live. Nalnish had arranged for her to stay in his teepee along with Ayana and Dakota, at least initially. This was both an honor and a practical solution. As the children's guardian, he was responsible for their welfare, and as their adoptive mother, Margaret was now part of his extended family. The teepee was larger and more comfortable than Margaret had expected. The floor was covered with buffalo hides and woven mats, and there were backrests made of willow branches that provided surprisingly good support. Her sleeping area was separated from the others by a curtain made of decorated leather, giving her privacy while keeping the family together. Bright Moon took charge of Margaret's education in Comanche ways. Every day the old woman taught her new skills: how to tan hides properly, how to make pemmican that would keep for months without spoiling, how to identify medicinal plants and prepare them for different ailments. But the most important lessons were about community life and social relationships. Margaret learned the complex rules about how different family members should interact, how decisions were made within the band, and how conflicts were resolved peacefully. She discovered that Comanche society was much more democratic than she had expected, with women playing important roles in many decisions. The children flourished in their return to their people. Margaret watched with joy as they reconnected with cousins, aunts, uncles, and grandparents they hadn't seen since their parents died. But she was touched to see that they always made sure to include her in their activities, and continued to treat her as their mother. As winter settled over the camp, Margaret found herself becoming more integrated into the community. She contributed her skills in reading and writing, helping people compose letters to relatives on reservations or dealing with government officials. Her knowledge of white culture and language made her valuable as a translator and cultural interpreter. She also discovered that several other white people had been adopted into various Comanche bands over the years, some as children who had grown up completely as Comanche, others as adults who had chosen this life for various reasons. These individuals helped her navigate the challenges of adapting to such a different way of life. But Margaret's greatest satisfaction came from watching Ayana and Dakota heal from the trauma of losing their parents. In the cabin, she had seen glimpses of their resilience and strength, but here among their people they bloomed like flowers after rain. They laughed more, played freely with other children, and began to speak of their parents without the deep sadness that had marked their earlier conversations. One evening in February, as Margaret was helping prepare a feast to celebrate the successful return of a hunting party, Stone Bear approached her with a serious expression. "White woman," he said, using the formal address he employed when discussing important matters, "I have received word from scouts that soldiers are searching for you. They have been asking questions in settlements, showing people a description of a white woman who disappeared with Indian children." Margaret felt her heart sink. She had known this day might come, but she had hoped the cavalry would eventually give up their search. "What do they want with me?" she asked. "They say you were kidnapped by hostile Indians. They want to rescue you and return you to your people." Stone Bear's tone made it clear what he thought of this explanation. Margaret almost laughed at the irony. "I wasn't kidnapped. I chose to come here. This is where I belong now. I know this and our people know this. But white soldiers do not understand such choices. They think all white people must prefer to live with other white people.